Good morning and welcome to our Bigfoot series. This is back by popular demand. We did a webinar in the fall. If you missed it, you can visit ODNR's YouTube page and check it out. I'll put the link in the chat in just a minute. I'm Alyssa Yapel and I'm going to be helping with the chat today, along with my coworker Jenna, who's in the background. So if you have any questions as we go through the program, go ahead and use the Q&A. But as I was saying, this is back by popular demand. We had a great response to the previous webinar on Bigfoot, and we decided we're going to do a whole month-long series. So today we will be talking about the legend of Bigfoot with John Hickenbottom, naturalist from Salt Fork State Park. Next week, what's coming up is the evidence. So just keep that in mind if you have questions. We will be covering evidence next week. The third week is the hunters. And then the final week, we're really going to get fun with it and have an actual hunt and get out and do some live streaming. So I'm going to send it to John to get started now. Here you go, John.
All right. Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Am I good?
You're good.
Awesome. So thanks, Alyssa. Again, this is back by popular demand. This is the Bigfoot. So the last Bigfoot webinar we did was everything that I could assemble about Bigfoot condensed down into one hour-long presentation. So the way that I approached this was I sort of took every portion of the original webinar and expanded on it. So today's portion is sort of the history of Bigfoot. So Bigfoot around the world. How the oral traditions of ancient cultures contributed to what we have as a modern idea of Bigfoot. And while I had to kind of stop myself from supplying evidence for some of these stories because that's next week's. So this is kind of just the synopsis of some of the more well-known and some of the more obscure Bigfoots through history, if that makes sense. So starting out, this is a fun map of kind of the different names that Bigfoot-like creatures have throughout the world, and you can see almost every major continent has some sort of giant woodland bipedal creature. Now, in some of these, we'll see when I kind of go in depth with some of them, you'll see that they're not necessarily, they don't call them like Bigfoots. They don't use sort of the modern terminology for Bigfoot. They don't use like hominid or, large bipedal creature. Some of them are called forest spirits or mountain devils and things like that. And I kind of touched on that in the original webinar with why some places got their names. But in this, we're looking at it, you have to look at it through the lens of kind of an anthropologist. Like we're interpreting oral traditions and things like that with a modern lens. So some of the things we'll get to, it's not like an exact fit for Bigfoot, but we can kind of look at it that way. So starting out is kind of a famous one. This is the Yeti. Now, anthropologists and historians have traced belief in Yeti, which is more or less a quintessential Bigfoot that rather than living in the forests of Ohio or Northern California, lives in the Himalayas, the snowy mountains where Everest is, and lives in those rocky, kind of inhospitable areas. And it's depicted more or less like a modern Bigfoot, just it usually has white fur. Some accounts have it as having a brown or reddish fur, but normally it's sort of like a polar bear, it's adapted to its environment. The interesting thing about the Yeti is that it was taken very seriously for a very long time. The Royal Geographic Society, kind of a society of explorers, where you would, have reports and things peer-reviewed. If you made a major discovery, that was who kind of put the seal of approval on your discovery. The Royal Geographical Society actually funded expeditions to try to find and kill or capture a Yeti. through the 19th and the 20th century was really, really taken very seriously. And actually, the Tenzing Norgay and Sir Edmund Hillary, who kind of achieved Mount Everest fame, they're kind of synonymous with Mount Everest in the Himalayas, claim to have seen it. And actually, Edmund Hillary, for the first edition of his biography, or first edition of his autobiography and memoirs, included an account of finding Yeti footprints, but then in the second edition had omitted that. So that's kind of interesting. There are footprints and hair samples that have, just like the modern Bigfoot in North America, there are footprints and hair samples and anecdotal evidence, eyewitness reports. And there was also an alleged hand, a mummified hand, and an alleged scalp in a monastery in the Himalayas. Now, the fun thing about the hand is the hand kind of got lost. It was they wanted to have tests done on it to see if maybe they could narrow down what species it came from, what it was, and got put in a crate and shipped off and then disappeared. So the hand doesn't exist. The scalp still exists, but the scalp specimen that they have is probably what believers view as a reproduction of the original. The current scalp looks identical to the old photos of the scalp specimen that the monastery had in their possession, but this one, I think it's been proven to be a type of Asiatic black bear. And the story goes that it was lost and had disintegrated to such an extent that it was gotten rid of, and then they made a copy of it out of black bear fur. So the scalp and the hand specimen are kind of one of those things you have to take with a pretty large grain of salt. But the Yeti's interesting because it's that abominable snowman. That was kind of the popular name for the Yeti. The Yeti's a more traditional name. The abominable snowman was taken pretty seriously, and even into modern times, there's an interesting event that happened in Russia, the Dyatlov Pass incident, where nine Russian cross-country skiers actually disappeared. They were very experienced. They were members of rough terrain hiking groups and cross-country skiing groups, and they disappeared under really strange circumstances. And when their bodies were discovered, they were discovered in such a way that made for really, I won't really go into like the graphic details, but it made for there were a lot of questions even persisting to modern times about what happened. And one of the theories was that they encountered an abominable snowman because of the position that they were in. So there was two of the bodies were discovered they were outside of their tent, but they had actually cut their way out of the tent. They didn't use the zipper or the flap. They'd used a knife and cut the back of the tent and ran out that way. So one of the theories is like, well, something else was trying to get into the front of the tent. So it's kind of an interesting thing to look at. And again, I wanted to start with this because this is an animal that was taken very seriously in the late 19th and early 20th century, kind of when some of the major discoveries were happening in zoology, when people were really expanding, our view of the world expanded greatly then. There were uncharted places in China that were opened up to explorers. There were places, in deepest Africa that had never been explored and never been mapped. So, this time period, that sort of late 19th and early 20th century, was a time of great exploration. And, there were actual expeditions. Clear up and through, I believe, the 1940s or 50s, there were actually still people getting real funding, not just, like a Kickstarter per se, getting real funding from institutions to go out and try to find this Yeti or abominable snowman. Clear up through the 1940s and 50s. So it was taken very seriously, and there are still reports today of creatures like this. So an interesting thing, and also very popular in modern culture, like the abominable snowman. As far as like hairy bipedal hominids go, I'd say there's Bigfoot and then the Yeti are probably the two most popular iterations of this creature. So,
Hey, John.
yeah.
Quick question that came in. Somebody asked, wasn't the hand supposedly an orangutan hand?
I think it was either an orangutan hand or it was also a Asiatic black bear paw that had kind of disintegrated to the point where it sort of looks like a human hand. I think that was one of the theories. But the hand, we don't know for sure because the hand was like lost. And, again, this is one of the, I mentioned the hand and the scalp, those are two things that we really have to take with a big grain of salt because the scalp proved to be made out of Asiatic black bear fur, and a bear's paw without the skin on it and without looking like a quintessential bear paw looks an awful lot like a hand, like a five-fingered sort of human hand. So yeah, it may have been an orangutan, it may have been a Asiatic black bear. I can't remember what the theory was behind that. Again, these are kind of, I would like to say I'm kind of telling the story of these legends, and rather than, I'm not really trying to prove or disprove anything here, because the evidence one is next week, and we're going to take a look at the evidence that has been collected for these things, and look at the hoaxes and the falsified evidence and things that have been that have gone through history with the Bigfoot legend. So I'm hoping to take a closer look at that next week. But yeah, I will definitely research the hand and the scalp thing with the Yeti for next week a little more to see if I can track down exactly what the circumstances were with that. So I hope that helps. All right. Moving on. Now this one's kind of interesting. The orang pendek. This is said to inhabit the remote mountainous regions of Sumatra, and forest tribes, local farmers, coffee farmers, because that's like high elevation coffee farms, Dutch colonists and missionaries all claim to have seen this creature. Now the Dutch colonists and the missionaries were probably getting secondhand accounts that were part of an oral tradition passed down from the forest, the forest and mountain dwelling tribes to the local farmers, to the Dutch colonists and the missionaries, because there's no like good firsthand accounts of this creature. But the description is it's short. It's actually shorter than what we think of as Bigfoot. Normally we're thinking of an animal between 8 and 10 feet tall, a big sort of, larger than a human, covered in hair. This is a small creature, 30 to 60 inches tall. And the nomadic tribes in the region have stories about outwitting these creatures during hunting trips. Like they were kind of competing during hunting trips and they would outwit these creatures. The interesting thing about this one is that, so this is a very long oral tradition in that region, and those in Indonesia and Sumatra. It's a very this tradition is passed down through those nomadic tribes and those forest tribes of these little hobbit creatures. It was sort of this legend was sort of disregarded for a long time as legend, much like a lot of Sasquatch legends are disregarded, until the remains of a subspecies or a separate species of the genus Homo, our genus, was discovered in that region in a series of caves. They found a small Homo floresiensis, is a very small, they called it the hobbit. That was the name for this animal, or this subspecies of our genetic line. So it was actually found, and it was found that it would have overlapped, that species would have overlapped with modern humans living in the region for a very short time, but probably long enough for an oral tradition to get started and get passed down through the generations of a small, sort of hairy, almost human-like creature living in the woods and sharing the region's resources. Hence the stories about them getting, and them outwitting this other species during hunting trips, because they were probably competing and sharing the region's resources together for a short time in their shared history. Now Homo floresiensis ultimately died out. There's fossil evidence of them, in that region, but it probably was. I believe that the going theory is that it was the start of this legend. That's an oral tradition that was passed down through history, through generations, and which is really fascinating to me to think about that a shared history with another bipedal hominid maybe contributed to our to at least one region's understanding of of this creature or creatures like it, Bigfoot-like creatures. So it's pretty fascinating to think about. All right, so one of my favorites here is Australia's Bigfoot. Now the Aboriginal cultures in Australia, the indigenous people in Australia, have a legend about the Yowie. And the Yowie, to me, is sort of we'll get to it later, but it's sort of Australia's parallel to the Wendigo in the Northeast, the first sort of one of the creatures that the First Nations people told stories about. The Yowie is shy, but very big, living in the outback. And I love some of the names for it. The Yahoo Devil, which is a fun name. But it was actually a subject once colonization started in Australia, and colonists heard these stories about the Yowie. There were actually like naturalist articles and expeditions looking for the Yowie, dating back clear into the 19th century. Now it's a big sort of gangly creature, but they are often depicted as like man-eaters. They'll snatch up men and eat them. So people that disappeared, it was often claimed that the Yowie got them, and that's kind of interesting because some of these legends that we're looking at ultimately they're turned into sort of moral tales. These sort of like stories about, this is why you should stay out of the dark, scary forest. This is why you should stay out of that dangerous mountain pass. This is why you should stay out of the swamp. It's because these creatures are there. Or if you look at even some of the Native American traditions, it's don't hunt more than you need, because don't commit any sort of don't commit any sin, because this animal will get you. They turn into these sort of moral fairy tales with some sort of ultimate like moral subject at the end. So the Yowie was kind of one of those where it was stay out of the outback, like stay out of the dangerous parts of the outback, otherwise this creature will get you. But Australia is fascinating. I mean, because it is rugged. There's not a whole lot of friendly landscape in the outback part of Australia, but it's also amazingly diverse. There's mountainous regions, there's rainforest regions, there's desert regions, coastal areas. But like the Tasmanian tiger, which inhabited Tasmania and parts of that, like the southern parts of Australia for clear up into the 20th century, is now extinct, but people still claim to get grainy cell phone footage of this dog-like marsupial that has supposedly been extinct for a long time. So they get almost this sort of Bigfoot-esque footage of it every so often, and people take it pretty seriously sometimes. So Australia is kind of interesting because it kind of embodies some of the unexplored areas. It kind of embodies that unexplored wilderness because some of the landscape down there is so unforgiving. So the Yowie kind of plays into that. There's this unforgiving man-eating creature inhabiting an unforgiving man-eating landscape. So it's kind of an interesting lens to look at this legend through. And sometimes they're depicted more man-like, as you can see in that statue. Sometimes they're depicted as kind of a Bigfoot with more claws and teeth than a conventional Bigfoot. But you can see in the lower left-hand corner there, the Bigfoot holding the kangaroo. Sometimes they're depicted more like that, or sometimes they're depicted more like a kind of a medieval demon. You can see in that other picture. So again, we're looking at this. We're we're not necessarily imposing a narrative to fit our modern beliefs, but we're looking at this and trying to interpret what these cultures were looking at and seeing if maybe they fit to our modern Bigfoot legend. So this is another one. Yes.
Sorry, another question that had come in, and this might be something that you plan to cover next week when we talk about evidence, but I'll ask anyways. We had a question, has anyone ever killed a Bigfoot?
So there have been lots of claims of people killing a Bigfoot. There has never been someone who could like deliver a Bigfoot body to, say, the Smithsonian. There have been lots of frauds also. Actually, there was one in 04 or 05 that made like national news. A guy claimed to have had an actual Bigfoot corpse and had it frozen, at his house, and had planned a huge press release and gotten scientific institutions involved, and it ended up being it basically ended up being a monkey suit stuffed with roadkill. So no one has, that we know of, no one has killed a Bigfoot and actually brought it to, say the Smithsonian or the American Museum of Natural History or someplace that would know what they were looking at. And there's been no actual physical remains found. And we'll cover kind of more of that and some of the reasons why that might be next week. But yeah, to date, no one has killed a Bigfoot that we know of. People have certainly shot at Bigfoot. There's if you go through, especially the North American stories, the North American eyewitness reports, there are always hunters that get startled by Bigfoot and take a couple of pot shots at it, and who knows whether they hit what they were looking at or not. But there are tons of stories about that. We're not. I can't say that those, that we've never had a body. There's never been a body, and that's kind of the big. If you're looking at it from the skeptical side, and I'll admit my skepticism on this. If you're looking at it from the skeptical side, there is no body, and until there's a body, it's really hard to say for sure that Bigfoot exists. Because if we had a body, we would be able to classify it. It would have a scientific name. They would sequence its DNA. They would figure out its closest living relatives. They would try to find a place for it in the fossil record. Everything is kind of hypothetical at this juncture. Everything involving that is kind of hypothetical, and that's because we do not have a body. And when we get to the evidence, I'll talk a little bit about like hair samples and tissue samples and things like that. And there's an interesting thing happening in the Pacific Northwest right now where they're looking at environmental DNA. So that's DNA that's kind of free floating out in the environment. So if let's say a spotted salamander, lives in a vernal pool in your, back in the woodlot in your backyard here in Ohio, it might only visit that vernal pool once or twice a year to breed and lay its eggs, but that because it's been there, you think about it, it's they breed there, so there's genetic material left over from that. They excrete, they use the bathroom in the vernal pool. Some of them may die. A great blue heron might eat one or two of them while they're breeding and while they're rolling around in that vernal pool, and leave behind remains. So that's sort of DNA that accumulates in the environment from the species that live there. And now there are techniques where they can actually take like soil probes and soil samples and kind of parse out all of the animals that live there. And they've done that in water before, where they've taken, deep water samples of certain lakes and been able to get a good cross section of what species of fish live there, what species of insect, aquatic insect lives there. So now they're doing that with areas like the Pacific Northwest, where they're able to look and see, are there unidentified things that we don't have the DNA sequence yet for, is there unidentified DNA out there? Because think about it, a 400 or 500 or 600 pound 8 foot tall animal is not going to be the cleanest animal. It's going to leave behind parts of itself everywhere it goes, whether it's hair or skin cells or bodily fluids or excretions, it's going to leave behind things. And if there are trace amounts of that out in the environment, then we're a step closer to like proving the existence of some unclassified hominid. But to date, there's been no body. So I hope that answers it pretty thoroughly. And I'll kind of go into depth with like some of the hoaxes and some of the things that maybe weren't hoaxes next week. Good. So this one's kind of an obscure one, and I just kind of had fun researching. I wanted to go through the ones that I knew, but I had fun researching kind of the more obscure hairy bipedal hominids that I could find around the globe. And this one is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Africa, the Kikomba. And it is described, rather than being more of your classical Bigfoot, it's described as more or less a large chimpanzee. To me, it's way scarier than a Bigfoot. I mean, chimpanzees to me are terrifying. They're super intelligent. They're super strong. And if you multiply it by 2 or 3, and it's a huge chimpanzee, it's terrifying to me. But that's now there's a theory that this one, much like the orang pendek, the Homo floresiensis, there's a theory that this might be an early hominid, the Paranthropus, that it might be a remnant population or an oral tradition of a remnant population of this earlier hominid. So this is another interesting one where, local tribes had their own names and own stories about essentially the same creature, and then missionaries, explorers, and colonists all heard these stories. And then, I'm sure that there were missionaries in a hut in the middle of the night in a place that that they've never been to before, and every sound sounded like this creature that the locals had told them about. So sightings were generated just out of sheer spookiness of those early explorers and things, just because they had heard these stories from the locals that they were dealing with, and then they get themselves in a creepy situation, and all of a sudden they're seeing this Kikomba that the locals had told them about. So, but this was a fascinating one. These are some naturalist drawings of what it may have looked like. But we do know that in that area there was an early hominid called the Paranthropus that would have kind of fit this description, sort of a man-sized chimpanzee, like a large chimpanzee, an early hominid. So whether this is a case where a remnant population of that hominid overlapped with a remnant population of modern human, or an early population of modern human, and those stories carried on, much like they did in Indonesia, if that is indeed the case, or whether this is an undiscovered creature, like we suspect Bigfoot to be, we suspect the North American Bigfoot to be some sort of unclassified bipedal creature. We don't know, but this was kind of a fun one, and I just wanted to throw this one in there because it illustrated that every culture has some sort of animal like this. Every culture has some legend about something that was almost human but not quite, usually covered in hair or something like that. So it's just fascinating to me. Some other ones include like the Yeren in China. The Yeren's kind of like, rather than being a large chimpanzee, the Yeren is more like a man-sized orangutan. Like it inhabits those forests there, and by all accounts, it's shy and friendly and wise. Unlike say the Yowie that we just covered. So this one's a fascinating one. I wanted to kind of get a more obscure one here too. So here we're going to move to North America now. This is an interesting one that I kind of touched on the last time we did this webinar, Sosunkwa, and I'm probably butchering that, but I'm not excellent at these more obscure pronunciations. But it's almost always, this is a Pacific Northwest indigenous Native American cultures, and Northern California and Washington and Oregon have this sort of shared legend of this creature. and it's almost always depicted as a female. I find this fascinating because the quintessential Bigfoot that we all think about is Patty from the Patterson-Gimlin footage, which we'll talk about kind of closer to the end. But Patty, you know, she appears to be female in the footage, and this legend almost always appears as a female, and she's often shown carrying a basket or a bag, and she's also the whistling Bigfoot. She masks and totems and carvings of this legend show her pretty often with pursed lips, like she's whistling. That's also fascinating. We'll talk about when we get to like the evidence and some of the sounds that have been recorded. One of the sounds that is pretty commonly attributed to Bigfoot is sort of a whistle or a hum or some sort of insect-like vibration that's not quite right, that doesn't fit with the environment. So it's fascinating to me that, you know, our modern Bigfoot sightings parallel this pretty ancient tradition of an animal. There's also this fascination with children. This legend, Sunqua, was said to sort of kidnap kids, who'd snatch up kids that were, you know, playing by a creek and take them off. I don't know, most of our modern Bigfoot experiences don't attribute any aggressive or violent natures to Sasquatch, but there seems to be a fascination with children. When we talk about the Boggy Creek monster a little later on, we'll see that I'll just mention it now. The Boggy Creek monster was often spotted around houses, you know, where like some teenagers were babysitting a house full of kids. And I've even heard reports from Ohio where, you know, a kid had some interaction with Bigfoot. It seems like these creatures, if they exist, they have some sort of curiosity and fascination with children. Maybe it's because their children are less likely to, you know, shoot at them or throw rocks at them or scream and run. They're more curious by nature. So maybe they interact a little better with children, and they know that, you know. So this is one of those in legend that was, you know, now it's negative, but it was obviously fascinated with children. It's said to steal children. And there are some reports of people being kidnapped by Bigfoot and then escaping, and you know, this could be a case of that, where like they wanted, you know, that there was the root of this legend could be in some instance like that, where someone was, you know, taken and escaped and was able to pass on this legend. And again, don't get me wrong here. I want to approach all this. I'm kind of telling the stories. So when I say things that sound like, when I'm saying things that I make them sound like fact, it's not necessarily that that's 100% true. I'm saying things from the perspective of these stories and why they're fascinating. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, oh, well, obviously this was because a Bigfoot kidnapped somebody. I'm saying that's one of the theories. If these creatures exist, this could be an instance where someone was kidnapped, they came back, they told the story, and that's the root of this tradition. But I do find it fascinating that in the same area that the Patterson-Gimlin footage was filmed, a creature, there was already a long oral tradition of a creature that fit pretty similar to what was caught on that footage. So it's very fascinating to me. So this is one of my favorites. This is also one that doesn't perfectly fit into that Bigfoot box, the Wendigo. Now the Wendigo is from the First Nations people in North America and Canada and parts of the Northeast. And again, this is like by far the most nebulous Bigfoot. You can kind of apply the Wendigo to just about anything, whether it's aliens, whether it's ghosts, whether you can kind of apply this to just about anything. It's even pretty often, I kind of picked pictures that looked more or less like a Bigfoot, but many times the Wendigo is pictured with deer antlers. So this is a really nebulous one, but it's also a fascinating one. You know, And I like to look at some of these, uh, it, us as humans, we can only recognize things if we have some sort of point of reference. If you were to go back and show, a Neanderthal a cell phone, they might describe it as a flat, shiny black rock. They might not describe it as something with buttons because they don't know what buttons are. So I think some of the interpretations of, say, something like a Wendigo with antlers, well, those people were around. It's kind of a bear with antlers. Well, those people were around bear, and they were around moose and deer and things all the time. So seeing something that maybe didn't quite fit their point of reference, they applied what they knew. They kind of made, well, it's big like a moose. It's hairy and stands like a bear, so it's kind of a moose bear, But again, this is kind of one of those nebulous ones. It doesn't quite fit with the Bigfoot thing, but also kind of does. Some of the stories are pretty interesting. Now, the Wendigo is kind of dangerous. It's kind of a dangerous Bigfoot in Native American tradition. It's got an insatiable appetite for human flesh, but the root of that is it's sort of a morality story that discourages cannibalism. So you have to think of it in this perspective. The First Nations, that's all in areas that are cold, big chunk of the year, Canada. And if supplies ran out, there would be situations where, say, a village would be maybe driven to cannibalism. And cannibalism almost universally in cultures the world over, cannibalism is more or less viewed as a taboo. I think we can all agree it's probably not cool. So this was most likely used as a kind of a morality tale to discourage cannibalism. And the story was, if you consumed human flesh, you would actually turn into the Wendigo and become one of these scary animals. So this legend has, it has connections, again, like I said, to Bigfoot, to UFOs, to basically any of the fringe that you want to delve into. You can find a connection on the Wendigo. The skinwalkers at Skinwalker Ranch as a whole other thing, sound very similar to, say, the Wendigo story. So very fascinating, kind of creepy Bigfoot. And here in North America, it's a fascinating one. And then here we have some that I'll cover: the Skookum, the Sasquatch, the Tonka. These are sort of the early representations of what we would kind of look at as the modern Bigfoot. You have some artwork here. Even the Iroquois in the Great Lakes region had these stories of these kind of warlike giants that would capture and kill, the Iroquois, the local Iroquois. So often these Native American traditions, these are more recent ones. When I say recent, I'm saying like maybe leading up to like just pre-Columbian and just post-Columbian Native American traditions prior to kind of the New World being, colonized. And they're often depicted as kind of guardians and big brothers of the forest. So I did read an interesting thing is that some traditions would, they say a village that would, so some Native Americans would not set up permanent villages. They would sort of follow food sources and have villages in different areas throughout the year. And I read an interesting legend on, I think it was the Skookum, where when they started seeing these Skookum footprints around their camp, they knew that it was time to move to their other, like around their village, they knew that it was time to move to their other village for the year, like for the rest of the season, because food was starting to get scarce in that area. So these creatures were coming closer to their village to sort of pillage their food, at night. And when they started seeing footprints, it was time to, well, we're going to pack up and move to kind of our winter village. So I thought that was fascinating, that, even in Native American culture, there was this interaction like that. So and it's also referenced as Earth's husband sometimes, which I thought that was really fascinating. You know, the Earth is being pictured as a you know, Mother Earth, and that Bigfoot is Mother Earth's husband. I thought that was fascinating. So other ancient Bigfoot stories, real quick. We've got the Epic of Gilgamesh has Enkidu, which was described as a hairy, mountain-dwelling wild man that befriends Gilgamesh, and they end up slaying a dragon. But then you have, actually in like the Old Testament, you have Esau is described as rugged and wild and covered in hair. Lots of different things. The Beowulf epic poem, the Norse epic poem, Beowulf, describes a creature Grendel, which is a lot of times, even in the old Viking artwork and the old Anglo-Saxon artwork, it's described as kind of a Bigfoot creature. And it's also fascinating if you've ever read Beowulf, or if you've, you know, there was a movie a few years ago. Grendel attacks a mead hall because of the noise. Every night when they would have a party, this creature would come and attack. Well, noise is often associated with Bigfoot encounters. You know, they're curious. They seem to be curious by nature. So I thought that was a fascinating one. These are just other Bigfoot traditions throughout history. I'm going to move along kind of quick so we can get down to like our Ohio Bigfoot stuff. Here's a pretty famous one, the Boggy Creek Monster. This is in Fouke, Arkansas, in an area known as Texarkana. The Fouke Monster is a sort of a swamp Bigfoot, and sightings of this go clear back to 1834. Eyewitnesses describe a gangly, long-haired creature, and this is a unique one among North American Bigfoot because the footprint usually has these, it's kind of long and has this narrow heel and 3 toes. So it's often seen and heard harassing livestock, startling hunters, prowling around homes with small children in them. And much like our beloved Ohio Grassman, the Fouke Monster became a local celebrity. There was a great film in 1973. It is a cult classic. I cannot recommend it highly enough if you can find it. Watch it because it is great. It is great if you're a Bigfoot enthusiast. It's great if you love old movies. It's great all the way around. I can't recommend it highly enough. Called The Legend of Boggy Creek. There's merchandise. There's festivals. You know, it's a cash cow in the Fouke area, and people still go and visit Fouke. You know, Bigfoot enthusiasts still make a pilgrimage to the Boggy Creek area in hopes of seeing the Boggy Creek Monster. So it's a pretty famous, much like our Grassman, it's a pretty famous Boggy Creek or Bigfoot. So then we have the Momo. This is the Missouri Monster. First reported sighting was in 1918, and then the most famous sighting was in 1972. It was a 2-week stretch of sightings all over the state, but usually around the Mississippi River. It's described as 7 feet tall with coarse carpet, shag carpet-like hair, and a pumpkin-shaped head. The interesting thing to this is its footprint is very similar to the Fouke Monster with the 3 toes, and the Honey Island Swamp Beast, which is another one I don't really cover. But the Honey Island Swamp Beast. So, you know, Bigfoot researchers kind of hypothesize that in that Mississippi River region, these creatures may migrate based on, you know, say a food source. So the Fouke Monster may also be Momo, may also be the Honey Island Swamp Beast, but they're sort of maybe a subspecies of the normal North American Bigfoot that, you know, they have 3-toed footprints. So again, we don't know. I'm not saying this as 100% fact, but I find it fascinating, you know, that there are similarities in that region amongst these animals. And then we have Patty, the quintessential American Bigfoot. I personally believe that this Bigfoot should replace Smokey Bear. I think she embodies everything about the American wilderness. You know, this is the spirit of the American wilderness right here in this 1967 still from the Gimlin Patterson footage. So this was filmed in Bluff Creek. This, my experience working here at Salt Fork, 95% of people, if you ask them what Bigfoot looks like, they're going to draw Patty right here, kind of looking over her shoulder. Now she's called Patty because of Roger Patterson. Bob Gimlin is still alive. He's been here at Salt Fork. He's been here at the Ohio Bigfoot Conference. Great guy by all accounts, and stuck to his guns all these years. Still says, and he'll say, it ruined my life. I wish I hadn't have been there. But it's a pretty fascinating thing, and I found this interesting chart researching this. Down here, you have the costume for Beneath the Planet of the Apes, which was a movie that came out in 1970. You have the costume there. That was kind of the height of special effects in 1970, and then you have it compared to the Patterson-Gimlin film. You can see that there's a huge difference between this kind of hokey gorilla suit and the Patterson-Gimlin film. There's a big difference between the two. Like the Beneath the Planet of the Apes thing looks like some novelty pajamas. So there's a big difference. There's like muscle definition and everything with this film. So this is by far, when it comes to North American Bigfoot, the Patterson-Gimlin film is the best evidence that we have. It's the best thing that we have to look at. And still the most compelling thing. I mean, every few years, the Discovery Channel or the History Channel does a re-examination of the Patterson-Gimlin film, and it's always inconclusive. Always. They never come up with whether it's real or not. But it's still fascinating. So that's something. It's still fascinating. Now that brings us to the Ohio Grassman. We have a really rich tradition of Bigfoot in Ohio. We have, and the Grassman, as it's described here in Ohio, is reported throughout Ohio. It's throughout western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, eastern Indiana. That creature, the descriptions are all pretty similar, and the behaviors are all pretty similar, even down into Kentucky and along the Ohio River. Very fascinating. This area also, I mean, a lot of people don't really appreciate living in Ohio. You don't appreciate that, this place was the Wild West at one point. West of the Appalachians. Like if you were, in the 18th century, west of the Appalachians, this was the Wild West. This place, we had, massive virgin forests, Appalachian foothills, the Great Lakes and the Great Black Swamp. Like this was rugged, western terrain. Kind of like we view things like the Grand Canyon now. It was the Great West, the great expanse of the West. Well, that was Ohio at one point. So even as soon as Europeans started getting into Ohio, there were reports of these strange creatures, and there were reports. The newspaper article that I have there is a report from Gallipolis about a gorilla that attacked a father and a daughter on a carriage ride. But all of these share pretty common behaviors with the Ohio Grassman, how we view it today. We have the Minerva monster up around Minerva, Ohio. That's a monster that would like periodically throw rocks at people's houses, and people would see them pretty frequently in their backyards and the state forests that are up there. It's a pretty well documented Bigfoot sighting, the Minerva monster. And if anybody ever gets the chance, I would recommend checking out it's several part film series on the Minerva monster and the Ohio Grassman, on the Trail of Bigfoot, I think it's called. It's really pretty in depth. I would recommend checking that out. I used it in my research for this. But the Ohio Grassman, it's especially important here at Salt Fork. We were designated by USA Today as one of the squatchiest places in North America, one of the squatchiest places to visit. And I have worked here literally since I was a kid. I started volunteering out here when I was 13. And I can tell you, I have talked to so many people who have had strange experiences out here. And experiences that are close to a religious experience where they did, they hunted and fished all their life, and then I'll talk to somebody who's in their, early 50s, and they'll say, oh, nope, never setting foot in those woods again. I've hunted and fished out here all my life, and I saw something I'll never, never go back. I've talked to people who've had really life-changing experiences. They've seen something out here. I know this park like the back of my hand, and I grew up out here, and I have not seen anything with my own two eyes here, but I have experienced some strangeness out here, and it is pretty fascinating. I mean, it is now part of our local culture. If you go to the carryout down the road, there's a giant life-size Bigfoot statue in the carryout. It's part of our local culture here. And to me, that connects us to those oral traditions in Central Asia and Northern California and the outback in Australia. Now we have a tradition that is going to get passed down through the generations. That connects us all the way back through history. That's one of our traditions now. That's part of the local folklore of this area. Salt Fork will forever be synonymous with the Grassman, with Bigfoot. And there's lots of compelling evidence. The Bigfoot researchers that I know and work with, I love them to death. They're great people, and have always treated me, so well. And here at the park, we always try to accommodate them. We let them do their thing. They always talk about how at other parks, if they're out howling and banging on trees in the middle of the night at 1 a.m., a park officer will come up and run them off. Like, what are you doing here? Why are you doing this? Why are here? If we see somebody behaving strangely, howling off into the woods, usually it's because they're a Bigfoot hunter, and we know what they're doing. We usually let them be, or we go over and say, hey, somebody at the lodge told me that they saw something cross the road a few nights ago. We work with them. We have a good open relationship with them. They let us know when there's something interesting happening. So it's really like this. Again, I have mentioned that I'm not 100% a believer, but I mean, I've been at this park since I was young, so this is part of me now. This folklore, this local tradition of the Ohio Grassman. This is part of my local tradition, and I find it very fascinating. And we try to embrace the Grassman here at Salt Fork, so I find it really important and really fascinating. We have sightings every year. This is not something I mentioned with like Momo, where it was like a string of 2 weeks, 2 week sightings, or a string of sightings for 2 weeks, and then it kind of died off. And you saw that with the Boggy Creek monster too, where it was like you have these like waves of sightings that kind of dissipate over time. Here at Salt Fork, I mean, it's pretty consistent, a few sightings every year. If it's not at Salt Fork, there's certainly the areas around Salt Fork. There are always eyewitnesses. Lots of people, call and ask us like, hey, who do I talk to about, I saw this thing, I don't know what to do, I don't know who to talk to, and we'll usually direct them to one of our Bigfoot folks. And a lot of those, if you're interested, look on the BFRO website for Ohio, like find the Ohio BFRO website, and there's actually like a database you can kind of go through and see all the reports that have been taken from this area. That's where this map came from. This map is actually interactive, I think, on the BFRO website. So it's really fascinating. And sightings remain consistent, and there have been park employees that have seen things. There are retired park officers that have said they've seen things. So I'm always hopeful I will have some sort of life-changing experience and come across the Ohio Grassman here at Salt Fork. I just haven't yet, but it would be very cool. And like I said, even if Bigfoot winds up not existing, it's part of our tradition here now, and I will always hold Bigfoot very dear. So this is a really fascinating part of our local history. So now I would be happy to take questions. I've actually finished up in a reasonable amount of time where I can take some questions if we have any. Normally we go like 10 minutes over because I go a little overboard with the slides, so I hope I kept it concise this time. And if we have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
We do have John.
Excellent.
Yeah, so let's see. We had somebody say they seem to live in all types of climates, but always in wooden areas. Are there any mountain or coastal sightings?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So there are mountain and coastal sightings. I mean, the Yeti is almost exclusively mountainous. Like the Himalayas, you know, that they're so high that things don't like they're not in forested areas. The things that grow up that high are things like lichen and moss. It's not there's not heavy, dense, thicketed forests up there. So yeah, I mean the Yeti is one of those like mountainous those mountainous the mountainous creatures. And then in the Pacific Northwest, all along the coast, the Native Americans that lived along the coast in the Pacific Northwest that would have depended on the the sea for much of their food sources. Those are the Native Americans that had the traditions of, say, like the whistling Sasquatch, the Susunkwa, like those are the so yes, there are lots of coastal sightings. I mean, there are totem poles that depict that creature on the coast in the Pacific Northwest. So yes, absolutely, there are lots of coastal sightings. I kind of was generically lumping everything into the woodlands, but even the Yowie in Australia, some of that is in like the desert outback. Some of those are in areas that are that's more like Nevada. It's desert. Like so that's so the all environments. And yes, there are sightings in mountainous regions. Here in North America, there are sightings in mountainous regions. I just read an interesting sighting about a sighting from the Appalachian Trail up near Katahdin. At the end of the Appalachian Trail, someone had a sighting last year during the pandemic. One of the last people to get a through hike accomplished during the pandemic. There was a report from the AT. So yeah, there are lots of mountainous sightings. Absolutely. I'm sorry if I kind of glazed over that stuff. Again, I'm looking at it through the lens of our friendly Ohio Grassman. So I try to expand as much as possible to a global Bigfoot. So
yeah. So do the people looking for Sasquatch carry guns, and do they intend to kill him? Would someone be allowed to shoot Sasquatch when he is sighted?
Well, that's a good question. Overwhelmingly, no. None of the Bigfoot researchers that I know I've never seen one, packing heat out during an excursion. I've never seen one doing that. And most of them say if they came face to face with one, they would run. Like they would run as fast as possible because it would scare them to death, if they came right face to face with one. No. And as far as would they be allowed to kill one, that's now personally speaking, I mean, why would you want to? This is a national icon. Why would you want to kill a Bigfoot? But it's interesting. There are some states, I think, this was just in the news recently. I think Oklahoma there was a congressman in Oklahoma that just said he wanted to, to make it legal to shoot a Sasquatch. And obviously it was some sort of publicity stunt, but that was put on like the floor of the state. The state house had a hearing about whether or not you could kill a Sasquatch. On the opposite end of that, some states, I believe Wisconsin, maybe even Michigan, some states have it explicitly, you cannot kill a Sasquatch if you found one. Like they're explicitly protected, in the DNR guidebook, they're explicitly protected. Now, some of that is obviously for safety reasons, because if you see someone in a monkey suit that you think is a Sasquatch and you shoot them, you are now a murderer, So some of them are, that's obviously a safety thing. But it is interesting. I mean, I personally, if tomorrow we found out 100% Bigfoot existed, all these stories are true, I would be right there saying, no, these things need 100% protection, like throw everything at them. Endangered Species Act, this is a national treasure, so I don't know why you would want to kill one. Photographic evidence, DNA evidence, good photographic evidence is what I mean by that. Now one that dies of natural causes, heck, a body would be great, but I have never met a Bigfoot researcher that actively carried a gun to, dispatch a Bigfoot if they saw it. Most of them carry, I mean, you wouldn't talk about like gadgets. The Bigfoot community has its gadgets. So most of them carry things like thermal imaging equipment and drones and things like that. So all stuff that they can collect kind of passive evidence that isn't, harmful. Now, if you go back and when we talk about the hunters in part 3, the Bigfoot hunters, some of those guys, they really were loaded for bear, some of those guys were going on safari to look for Bigfoot, but that's like the early 20th century. That's back when it was very fashionable, to do that. And now, I mean, I don't know. I could never bring myself, if I saw one, if I was out deer hunting and saw a Bigfoot, I could never ever bring myself to kill it, and again, I'm not even like 100% a believer. I'm just a naturalist doing what we do here. So yeah, I've never met one that carries a gun though. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. So we're a minute over, but we have tons of a handful of questions still. So let's try and get through some of these. So Troy asks, where's the best place at Salt Fork to look for Bigfoot?
Okay, that's a great question. So some of our Bigfoot hotspots include the Hosak's Cave area. Hosak's Cave is one of our local kind of unique rock formations. It's a rock shelter and overhang. That whole area is pretty rugged, and there's lots of little valleys and ravines and things. And there's a good concentration of sightings there. The Morgan's Knob Loop Trail area near the cabins is kind of also a local hotspot. The group camp area and the wildlife area, our group camp area, there's part of the Buckeye Trail runs through there, all very rugged places people don't go frequently. That's kind of a hotspot. So those 3 areas are kind of our big hotspots, like everything off Parker Road. And the wildlife areas are really, there's lots of reports out there. Actually, the closest thing that I've ever had to like a strange experience, I'm not even going to say like a Bigfoot experience, was on Parker Road. But that's the closest thing that I've had to some sort of experience was out there. I heard I'm pretty good with my nature noises. It kind of comes with the territory, and I heard a very strange noise that I still have not, I have not found anything close to it other than a recording of an alleged Bigfoot from Northeast Ohio. That's the closest thing that I've found to sound like that. So that's my closest thing to an experience was out on Parker Road. So the wildlife area is a good place to start. But also I would recommend the Hosak's Cave area. Maybe in the off season, go out there in the off season when it's not, that's a really popular trail. So when it's not being used very heavily. But those are all good places to start. But there are reports all through the park. Those are just kind of the hot spots.
Okay, and Silas asks, what kind of sounds does the Ohio Grassman make?
So we will cover that more in the evidence part, but howls, grunts, a really interesting sort of zipper noise has been recorded. It's really hard for me to describe other than it sounds like the zipper on a tent, Then there are these things that we call tree knocks, where it sounds like 2 pieces of wood being hit together, a stick hitting a tree very loudly, and we'll talk about that in the evidence portion and in the hunt portion that we do, the kind of part 4 of this. We'll talk about tree knocks because that's a pretty integral part of the Bigfoot hunting. So those are all sounds, and throughout North America you have whistles and hums and clicks and chatters. There's an interesting sound clip from California called the Samurai Chatter, where it sounds like a kind of an old hokey samurai movie, this sort of like chattering noise. Very fascinating. If you look it up on YouTube, I'm sure you can find like the Samurai Bigfoot Chatter. Sounds like, an old 1970s samurai movie soundtrack. So lots of interesting noises, but the Ohio howl is kind of the quintessential Ohio Grassman noise that everybody thinks about. So howls and grunts and things like that.
All right, and out of all of the different, the names that you've covered today, and I don't know if you can call them species, but why is Bigfoot so popular amongst all of them?
Well, I think it's easy to pronounce for one, because you saw me kind of stumble over some of the pronunciations of some of the, international Bigfoot names. But the term Bigfoot came about with the kind of the Bluff Creek sighting and some sightings that had happened just before that. Jerry Crew, the Jerry Crew sightings, which was like a work area that had some oil drums disturbed and some things moved around and these big footprints found. The local paper had an article in there, big space foot, found in this area, and it had a picture of the plaster cast, the original plaster cast. And that was the first time that the word Bigfoot had kind of appeared. Well, and especially after the Patterson-Gimlin footage, Bigfoot kind of became the generic name for a Sasquatch. So we're talking like the 1960s is when that came about. They didn't call them, there wasn't a Bigfoot legend. There weren't Bigfoot hunting societies prior. There wasn't a BFRO prior to all this. So it was kind of it wasn't until more modern times that they started kind of connecting the dots, like, oh, the Yeti and the Yeren and the Yowie and the Wendigo and Sasquatch, they might all be talking about a similar creature. It was so these Native Americans talk about this thing called a skookum, and the skookum was its own thing, and then these ones talk about the Sasquatch, and then these ones talk about the Wendigo. So it was kind of, each thing was separate until it wasn't until kind of more, and that has a lot to do with like communication. You think about it, there wasn't social media back then. It's a lot easier to take a look at it in a broad spectrum in more modern times. Like you can kind of look at it, oh, these things all might be connected. So yeah, that's when the term Bigfoot kind of came about then, if that helps.
Yeah, and 2 more questions and then we got to wrap up. Troy asks, do you have any info on the Rosie Cabins sightings?
I do not. I can find out about it. I will ask. I've got a person that'll know off the top of his head, most likely.
All right, and maybe
we'll ask and let you know next week.
Sounds good. And then this might be one that we will talk about next week too. But somebody asked, why hasn't a Bigfoot ever been photographed on a trail camera?
Oh, well, there's some theories behind why they're infrequently captured on trail cameras. There have been some compelling trail camera footage that has not been like very clear that could be a Bigfoot. But the theory is that, first of all, they're supposedly they're clever, and whether it smells like us and they're just wary of it, or whether they're just smart enough to outsmart the Bigfoot hunter, we don't know. But there is some compelling trail cam. I mean, out there is some compelling trail camera footage of what may be something like a Bigfoot, and I'll talk about that next week. And I will actually put out some trail cameras for week 4. So maybe we'll be the first. We don't know. So.
All right. Well, thank you, John. Always a pleasure having you on. And as we talked about, throughout the webinar today, next week we'll be talking about evidence, same time, same place, 10 a.m. on Wednesdays. So next week is evidence. The following week is the hunters, and then finally wrapping up with the actual hunt. So we hope that you will join us then. And I also want to mention that if you want to check out our other virtual programming that we have, the link is in the Q&A there. Just go to our OhioDNR webpage and you can find our virtual programming schedule. This month, we're also celebrating Women's History Month, so we will be highlighting women throughout the Department of Natural Resources in a variety of fields through our series called She's a Force of Nature. So if you're interested or know anyone that's interested, please direct them to the virtual programming page, and have a good week. Bye.